Well, howdy doody, sociologists. Let's get stuck into lesson number 5. Our learning goals today. See if you can guess how tall my hat is. Nah. You're going to know the nature of social movements, know the history of how we understand social movements, and you're going to be able to analyze the nature and the purpose of a social movement. Go you. Okay. The nature of social movements. Here's a quote. Remember, if you can remember a few quotes and insert them into answers, it makes you look very smart. Anyway, once we've experienced solidarity, we can never forget it. Ronald Aronson. So, once you've been part of a social movement and seen that people power really does make a difference, it's incredibly powerful. There's a great quote out there, I can't remember who said it, that says, don't ever question whether a small group of people can make a big difference, because that's the only thing that's ever happened, i.e. all social movement has started with some small group of people. I even got that quote right. Anyway, social movements can emerge from need for change, and social movements have a vision of a society they want. So you've got to think about, why does the social movement start in the first place, and what kind of vision of society does it want? So thinking right back to that first lesson about social movements can emerge due to perceptions of inequality, injustice, oppression, and unmet needs, I think were the 4. Look at me and my memory. Sometimes activists feel that they aren't heard, or they don't have enough power to enact change. Yeah, so that's that one about unmet needs. Of course, it's all subjective. This is like the subjective feeling of whether or not you think your needs are unmet, but subjectivity is everything sometimes. So here's a random slide, and these are about social movements, and here's all the possible things that social movements can do. This is just a different way of looking at it. Yeah, it's not from the textbook, but is a social movement going to transform the worldview? Is it going to create some alternatives? Is it to team up? Is it to change the way governing works? Is it just to wake people up? Hashtag woke. Is it to protect people? Is it to provide vision? Or is it to regenerate some kind of culture? The nature of social movements. Now, social movements are not trends, yeah? So, sweet clothes or Tamagotchis or the latest video game, whatever, that's not a social movement. Sometimes you hear people saying, oh yeah, the social movement about Karen from Bunnings or whatever. That, be careful not to accidentally confuse fashion with trend. I mean, don't confuse fashions and trends with social movements. That's what I mean. Yeah. Trends aren't in response to inequality or oppression or perceived unmet needs or inequality. However, not everybody who sees injustice will act. Okay, we've got this thing called lethargy or inaction or inertia. It's a really tricky thing. I was going to do my PhD on it at one point, but then I decided I couldn't be bothered, which is rather ironic. So yeah, issues alone do not make people act. So the question, and I'm not sure that anybody's completely nailed the answer to it, is what does make people act? Yeah, it's 2 different people could be experiencing the same negative things. One decides to start a social movement, the other one doesn't. What is the difference? However, as Meyer said in his research from 2007, the best predictor as to whether or not you will act is literally if you've been asked to act. Yeah. So, we need this. I need you to be less sexist. Can you do that? Oh, yeah, okay. Sweet. Okay, let's play a fun little game called Trend or Social Movement. Is that a trend or a social movement? Correct, it's a trend, and a very weird one. Trend or social movement? Correct, it's a social movement. Occupy Wall Street was a protest that began in the US in Wall Street about income inequality. Talked about how the fact that the richest 1% of people are insanely wealthy compared to everybody else, and they're getting richer. Trend or social movement? That's right, it's a social movement. This was a march, it looks like it's from the 60s, to stop segregation in public schools. Segregation was where African American and white Americans were sent to different schools. Doesn't exist in law anymore, although you do still find schools in the States where there's way more of one race than another. Oh, and I do believe that person there is Martin Luther King. Well, at least it looks like him. Trend or social movement? That's correct. It's a trend. It's unicorn hair. I would really like someone to come to class with that. Please do it. Right, let's talk about the history of understanding social movements. It's important for you to understand that we're talking about the history of understanding social movements, which is not exactly the same as just the history of social movements. Yeah, this history of understanding social movements is a history of how thinkers, especially sociologists, have thought about how to understand social movements. There is a link between them, obviously. As social movements have changed, so have the way that sociologists and other thinkers have thought about those social movements. Okay. In the 1800s, by and large, people thought that social movements were basically just socialists and other working class people. Yeah, there was a lot of inequality between the working classes and the upper class back then, so they were the people who were most interested in having social movements to try to deal with some of those inequalities. By the 1930s, we see this extremely influential thinker, Sigmund Freud, a psychologist who invented psychoanalysis. Very influential in a number of fields, but he influenced sociologists to start thinking about ideas and emotions when it came to social movements. So what kind of ideas and emotions motivate people to start social movements? What kind of ideas and emotions motivate people, motivate social movements to be successful? For example, the charismatic mob leader who would be appealing to emotion. A really good example of a charismatic mob leader, perhaps it's no coincidence that Cantrell wrote this in 1941, would be Adolf Hitler. Very charismatic leader. Was able to, just with the power of words, evoke emotions in his followers and get them to do all kinds of crazy things. By the 1960s, which was a huge decade for social change and social movements, we see ICT and the use of mass media like TV made society way more complex and way more globalized. Way more globalized because mass migration and plane flight and stuff was much more easy, so there was a lot more mingling of ideas, a lot more migration, stuff like that. In the 1960s, sociologists started to ask a harder question. Rather than just asking, how do social movements start, blah, 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 they started asking, why do social movements start? Why do they succeed? Now, if you've ever heard me rant about Bloom's taxonomy before, you'll know that I believe that how questions are a lot easier to ask and answer than why questions. Answering a why question requires you to try and delve into the motivation of the people involved. And so to do that, sociologists started to involve the activists themselves in understanding social movements. They would hold focus groups as part of their research with the activists themselves to find out what their motivation for starting social movements were. By the late 1900s, so coming into 80s and 90s, we start seeing C. Wright Mills's sociological imagination coming into play, which focuses on historical, cultural, critical, structural factors. I think they're the four, and also the idea of seeing the strange and the familiar, and seeing public issues coming out of personal problems. Go C. Wright Mills. He pops up all over the show. And there was a focus on the social change that social movements create. So rather than just focusing on the social movements themselves, it was like, well, okay, what social change were they aiming for, and were these social movements successful in achieving that social change? Which is why the official topic name for this unit is Social Movements and Social Change. So just a brief trip down memory lane. Here is some social movement types from the 1800s. You got your working class there. Here is Sigmund Freud, the famous psychoanalyst who helped sociologists to start thinking about ideas and emotions when they look at social movements, and he's got a very dainty way of holding his cigar there. I love it. Moving into the 60s now, huge decade for social movements, and here we see a protest that looks like it's about reproductive rights. Yep, something inequality. Put motherhood in a test tube. Yeah, so possibly this is about contraception or something. Yeah, nice. And here's our main man, C. Wright Mills. The more we understand what's happening in the world, the more frustrated we often become, for our knowledge leads to feelings of powerlessness. We feel that we are living in a world in which the citizen has become a mere spectator or a forced actor, and that our personal experience is politically useless, and our political will a minor illusion. There you go, great quote there, C. Wright. Love ya. All right then, today's activity, it's all about analysing the nature and purpose of a social movement. There's the definition of analyse again. So here we go. The purpose of a social movement is one of these: carry out social change, resist social change, or roll back a social change that's already happened. I want you to pick one of these three purposes. Do an analysis of it. So pick one of those purposes and split it up into three categories and explain the links between the three. So you might pick resist social change. What are three subcategories of resisting social change? You might say they might think that the social change was bad in the first place, and then they might want a different social change instead of it, whatever. So divide one of those three into a further three and see if you can come up with some links between the three. You might find that a bit tricky, but give it a shot. Our first video is called The Power of Social Movements. Take it away. And this choice one is called How to Start a Social Movement. Nice.
I want you to think back to October last year. The jacaranda flowers on campus have started falling, and just like so many other students, I know that I've got to pick up my game if I'm going to scrape that pass in second year statistics. Fast forward to this year, and I, that same undergraduate psychology student, find myself sitting next to the Prince of Cambodia at an intimate dinner in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. Admittedly, if I hadn't have taken an idea and actioned it into a social movement, I wouldn't have been sitting next to the Prince of Cambodia. In my opinion, social movements are one of the most intriguing phenomena of civilization. Think hashtag Black Lives Matter, hashtag Not in My Name, hashtag I Will Ride With You. And what's so interesting about movements like the hashtag I Will Ride With You campaign is that they bring people together and they form this collective identity. And what you've got is you've got people who would never otherwise cross paths, willing to ride with each other on the trains in Sydney. So how did I, that same undergraduate psychology student, just scraping a pass, like so many people before me, find myself starting a social movement? What I want to share with you today are three key tools that you can use to start a social movement. The first being a team. You need a team. Now, it's going to be deciding whether you need that ride or die buddy. You know the person I'm talking about in your friends, the person who'll do the Macca's run at 3 a.m. We've all got one. Or maybe you want to engage an intimate team, the people who will follow your idea. Now, my movement, it needed a team across the Asia-Pacific region. And I was able to do that because in my position as an appointed associate of a UNESCO chair, I had that access. But earlier this year, my own movement, we almost missed out on a now star team member. We were having this networking night at university, and this person, let's call him Tim. Tim came from a distant university. Now, my team was so focused on being able to attract the easily accessible people that they'd written Tim off. Tim didn't appeal to them because he went to a distant university and they couldn't envisage him traveling regularly to engage with our movement offline. But Tim interested me because he'd done it once already. He'd taken time out of his Thursday night, he'd gotten dressed, he'd worked out the travel logistics, he'd come to our university and he'd engaged. And so what did I do? I stalked him on social media. And what his social media revealed to me is that not only was Tim from a different community, but he had a technical skill that my movement desperately needed. He was tech savvy. So, not revealing to Tim that I'd stalked as far back as his 2011 vacation photos, I invite him out for dinner. And after that dinner, Tim joins our team. Which brings me to point 2. You need access to different networks. Now, I'm not saying that you need access to people in different countries if you're focusing on your own community. But with the rise of social media technology, we're now able to talk to people who we'd never envisaged talking with before. So me knowing that Tim was from a different community than my own, that allowed me to make that judgment. I knew that if I engaged Tim in my movement would suddenly have access to his community. And this brings me to point number 3. You need low-cost participation. And this comes into collectivism, this idea that we'll like a page, we'll share a post to support something. You need to make engaging in your movement fun and easy. So, what does starting a movement through social media look like? Does it mean getting people to share a post? Does it mean getting them to join a group? Does it mean getting them to retweet? Well, what I've done is I've simulated starting a global movement because, let's be real, an Asia-Pacific movement wasn't enough for me. What I've done is, over a 1-week period, we've started a global youth network from Brisbane, Australia. And I've addressed these 3 tools. Number 1, I have a team. I'm aiming across the world. My 2 team members I've met through friends. One comes from Manila and one comes from New York City. And this brings me to point number 2. I have access to different networks. I knew that in my position as an appointed associate of a UNESCO chair and these 2 team members, that we were able to engage with other young people in multiple countries across the world. 3, we kept participation low cost. So how do people engage in our movement? Remember, we were starting a global youth network because the movement behind that network was intended to mobilize young people interested in connecting and getting them to take their initiatives offline. So we created a link that was attached to a Facebook page where they could become a member. In observing the analytics, a few interesting things happen. So on day 1, I share my post. I make it public on Facebook. And as you can see, by day 3, we've reached 10 countries across the world in this one post. But a couple of interesting things happen. On day 3, my team member from Manila, he shares the post as well. So our access to young people in Southeast Asia considerably increases. But something interesting happens on day 3. We've got a Tim. Tim comes from Tanzania. And what I find out about this Tim is that they start randomly adding in these people that we haven't even seen before. We don't know who they're adding in. They're not known to our networks. And so this excites us. And I want to encourage this. I want to let Tanzanian Tim know that this is good. I want them to know that I've acknowledged this. And so I reach out to them and I say, hey, thanks for joining our network. And thanks for encouraging others to join as well. And by observing the analytics, what we find is that Tanzanian Tim continues to add in more participants. Jump to the next day, and my team member in New York City reshares my post to his network. And what you can see is that just after 4 days, we've got the start of a global youth network. We've got the start of a social movement. Jump to the next day, day 5. And we couldn't have anticipated this, but we find a second Tim. Tim comes from India this time. But Indian Tim differs because Indian Tim starts adding in people that we already know. The people that Indian Tim were adding in, my team, we already knew who they were. So what Indian Tim was doing was he was catalyzing those fence sitters, those people who didn't want to join the network. Because remember, they had already been exposed to our idea up to 3 times already, and they hadn't joined. So what Indian Tim was doing was simply pushing them. But we're at this stage of collectivism, and we want to get beyond that. Earlier this year, I flew to Manila. It's not a short flight, by the way. I flew to Manila because my own movement had a Tim there, and I wanted to invest in this Tim. And I invite them out for dinner. This was relatively low cost on their behalf because I'd just flown over 10 hours to see this Tim. And so, in classic Tim fashion, they go above and beyond. Because when she comes to pick me up for dinner, it's not just Tim, but it's a bunch of her friends as well. This was a classic Tim move. Why hadn't I anticipated that a Tim would not bring a bunch of their friends? And so, we're driving through Manila in this minivan. And the opening notes to Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody start to play. Oh, tomorrow, don't look, don't look, don't look, look out the window, don't look, don't make eye contact, no, they don't exist. And there's this building tension in the van. Tomorrow, don't look, you don't exist, don't look, they don't need to see you, it's fine, don't, no. And I can see eyes looking at me, wondering if it's okay to sing. I don't sing, by the way. And the tension continues to build. This was one of those make or break moments. This is one of those movements that could have taken my movement offline. And I knew that I had to put my dignity and my embarrassment aside. Tomorrow, no, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. Galileo, 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 Galileo! That one decision set the tone for what the relationship is today. We now have an active offline volunteer team in the Philippines for my own movement. So when you have these ideas for social movements, you need these 3 key tools. You need a team that can address the skills that you need. 2, you need access to these diverse communities. Now, I'm not saying that you need to start a global youth network, but that might be as simple as not having Friday Arvo drinks at the Red Room, but going to QUT. And 3, you need to make participation simple, and you need to make it fun. So what's the point of knowing how to start a social movement through social media? While my own social movement has taken me from that dreaded second-year statistics course and into private dinners with dignitaries, social movements are important because they allow groups of people to hashtag create change. So why do you need to know how to start a social movement? Hashtag climate change, hashtag Brexit, hashtag Trump. Thank you.
And now it's time for us to reflect. I want you to do a CSI on today's lesson. So I want you, when you're thinking of the top of the idea of social movements, what colour comes to mind? What's a symbol that you could draw that represents social movements? And what is an image? So give a little sketch of a social movement. Rad. Homework! Yay! Going to read the relevant pages from the textbook. That's 182 and 183. And you can answer these questions in your exercise book. Why do you think it's important to challenge the status quo? Now, you're young, so hopefully you want to. Society would never have changed if it wasn't for young people coming along and changing it. Young people are a very big influence on social change. And what negative effects might there be if society never changed? Thank you so much for getting stuck into this lesson. Always keep it real.